Hello and welcome to Projector, and on this episode, Rupert Everett makes his directorial debut while starring as Oscar Wilde in The Happy Prince. Following his release from Reading jail for gross indecency, Oscar Wilde, played by Rupert Everett, lives in exile in France under the name of Sebastian Melmoth, arranged by his friends Reggie Turner, played by Colin Firth, and Robbie Ross, played by Edwin Thomas. But Wilde is both haunted by his past and lonely, away from his wife Constance Smith, played by Emily Watson, and his children, and against the wishes of Constance and his friends, resumes his self-destructive romance with Lord Alfred Bosie Douglas, played by Colin Morgan, that led to his imprisonment. The Happy Prince is a long-time passion project for writer, director and star Rupert Everett, who spent a decade trying to get this film to the screen. That's how long he's been trying to get this project to fruition, to the point where recently the BBC Imagine documentary strand actually aired an episode about this movie, following Everett for several years, charting his struggle trying to find financing for it. And you can even see that in the film's credits, which have several screens worth of international production companies. It reads like an army, all chipping in little bits of funding here and there, and key to that was the involvement of his friends Colin Firth and Emily Watson, who both promised to be in the film should Everett ever be successful, and both kept their promise, in spite of the fact that Firth's stature had rose considerably, which at certain points made his involvement a little bit of a question mark. But Everett has been very dogged in his determination to bring this to the screen, largely because he's obsessed with Oscar Wilde. He's not only starred in several adaptations on film of Wilde's work, including An Ideal Husband and The Importance of Being Earnest, also alongside Firth, he has actually played Wilde on the stage, partly as a Trojan horse way of trying to get funding for this movie. This isn't the first biopic of Oscar Wilde on film. Notably, there was 1997's Wilde, which featured a well-cast Stephen Fry in the title role. In fact, in general, that movie has a terrific cast, many of whom weren't particularly well known in 1997, but you will have definitely heard of Jude Law, Ewan Griffith, Michael Sheen, Jennifer Ehle, Vanessa Redgrave, Tom Wilkinson, and Orlando Bloom makes one of his very first appearances in that movie. You definitely wouldn't have been able to assemble that cast nowadays, and they're all doing great jobs in that movie, but the film itself is fairly conventional. It simply goes through Wilde's life in a fairly ordinary way, and I did actually watch the film in preparation for this review, and it's interesting to compare the two films, not just because there are certain elements that are obviously recurring within them, but there is actually a bit of timeline overlap between the two films. Wilde actually covers a lot more of his life leading up to those events, whereas The Happy Prince is set afterwards. It's interesting because the film's attitude towards it is very different. In fact, in the case of Wilde, it's the most egregious mistake it makes with regards to the ending, because it tries to play the reunion between Bosie and Wilde as being something close to a happy ending-ish, and it feels incredibly disingenuous, especially because I watched this movie after I watched The Happy Prince, so I knew that that was a completely false note. And what makes it even more galling is that the movie completely deflates it seconds after the film ends, because it deals with the events that happen subsequently in a title card. It literally goes, hey, that ending note, it's completely untrue. It just skips over the ending of the story, and it feels so unearned and so rushed. So for that reason alone, The Happy Prince is necessary to right that particular wrong, but also I think that it's a much more invested, engaged biopic that is far more fitting to the character of the person that it's portraying. It's easy to see why Everett was so fascinated by Wilde's life. We're talking about someone who, for his time, was as famous as you could possibly be, to the point where he even toured across America, and yet, at the same time was subject to scandal, imprisonment, and later exile. It's that portion of Wilde's life that Everett focuses upon, and he found most intriguing. He didn't understand why previous biopics treated it as something of an afterthought, because he found the most rich material there. And when you watch The Happy Prince, you understand his logic. It makes perfect sense, because in his later years, Wilde lived this strange dichotomy. He was both famous and infamous, and Everett really explores that, especially in the earlier stages of the movie, in the film's prologue, where we first meet Wilde, and he's penniless, and his health is starting to decline, and he's wandering the streets, and as he does so, he's recognised by a wealthy couple who attended one of his plays years earlier, and the wife follows him down an alley, and she talks to him, and he manages to coax her into giving £5. Unfortunately, her husband has also followed her and confronts him and threatens that if he follows her, if he asks her for any more money, he will kill him. And it's at that moment the film cuts to a flashback of that very same husband laughing uproariously at one of Wilde's plays in performance. It's a savage and very pointed cut, and it underlines just how much Wilde's fortunes had so dramatically changed, but also just how fickle people can be. We flash back even earlier to see Wilde's initial arrival in France, arranged by his friends who are hopeful of a new beginning for him that we know will quickly turn sour. The hotel works out his real identity and throws him out, but he's also dogged by tourists that know who he is. This is especially seen in one sequence where a homophobic gang of young men chase Wilde and his friends, eventually into a church where he's forced to confront them, one of several moments that have a very pointed religious element to them, in the fact that it not only connects with Wilde's religious reawakening while he was imprisoned, but also casts him as a persecuted figure. Wilde in this movie is an extremely complicated character, dogged by his guilt and pain of what he has suffered in his recent years and what he's done to other people surrounding him, and yet at the same time is this extremely witty, gregarious, larger-than-life figure with a fantastic wit, and Everett captures both sides of his personality brilliantly. He really inhabits the character, as you would expect for someone who is so deeply connected to him. I think he really understands him, and his performance in this movie, which is very much a part of almost every scene in this film, is fantastic. He is phenomenal, but at the same time, there is always the sense that Wilde is never more comfortable than when he is performing, and you can even see that in his everyday life, particularly in his later years where he's applying makeup to cover the signs of his sickness, but also in that aforementioned flashback to the performance of The Importance of Being Earnest, where he's talking to the audience, and you compare that scene to later on in the movie to when Wilde talks about his most painful memory, namely a very, very unfortunate prison transfer via train at Clapham Junction, where he's forced to change trains, and while he's waiting, he's again recognised, and in this case, he becomes this cruel spectacle as one in particular rants and raves about him and spits on him and turns him into this mockery figure. It almost becomes like this version of the Stocks, and that incident at Clapham Junction almost functions as a dark mirror to the earlier flashback of Wilde at the play's performance, and in doing so, I think that Everett has discovered that Wilde's story very much has interesting comments about the nature of fame and celebrity that in many ways is still relevant even today. But the worst part about living in exile for Wilde is the isolation and loneliness, not just away from his friends, but also his family. He's acutely aware of the suffering that he's brought onto his wife Constance, played by Emily Watson, whose own health is declining, but also their 2 children, and he hopes to be reunited with them one day. And yet, at the same time, because he is so starved for affection, he begins to reconnect with Alfred Bosie Douglas, and it's at that point that things immediately start to turn. His friends, his family have all told him to stay away from Bosie, to the point where Constance's conditions about giving him money is that he does not reconnect with him, and even his friends are dismayed when they hear that Wilde is beginning to reconnect. And it's really interesting, particularly the relationship between Wilde and Robbie Ross, played by Edwin Thomas. It's clear that Robbie has an enormous respect for Wilde, both personally and professionally, and is in love with him, very obviously so, and at one point even confronts him saying, "Why are you doing this? Is our love, what we have created for you with this new identity, with this new life, not enough? Is my love not enough?" essentially. And the answer is, I simply don't love you that way. And the heart wants what it wants, essentially, and Wilde did not care for Robbie that way. That is how the events are dramatised in this movie, and it's really fascinating to see. And Wilde himself knows that this is a very bad decision for him that he will likely regret. He even says about himself, "I am my own Judas." He knows that in reconnecting with Bosie, that he is betraying himself, that he is ultimately the tent of his own self-destruction, and yet he proceeds because he knows that in meeting Bosie, he will experience the love that he craves, even if he knows that that will not last and it will burn out spectacularly. Wilde and Bosie's relationship is like a powder keg waiting to go off that is lit the second they reunite with each other. What Wilde sees in Bosie is someone that is young and vibrant and extravagant, and to some extent he lives vicariously through Bosie's youthfulness as they travel across Europe, going as far as Bosie's money will take them. While they're living this hard partying life, it's an extremely volatile relationship where Bosie can turn very suddenly. He can be extremely petulant and spoiled, and in doing so can be very scathing and brutal in his comments to Wilde, and just be very, very cutting. And Colin Morgan's performance as Bosie is really fantastic. He really nails just how cruel he can be and how ultimately he reveals himself in his character. And you watch this relationship play out, and it's fascinating to witness. Everett and Morgan carry a lot of the middle section of this movie together. They work off of each other brilliantly, and I was really, really compelled by seeing this relationship and its inevitable flame out. You know that things are just going to explode at some point. You can really feel Everett's passion for the subject in every frame of this movie, and to some extent that really elevates the film, because I do think that Everett is a lot more comfortable in front of the camera than he is behind it. This is his directorial debut, and I do think that he does show a lot of the first time mistakes that you see in a lot of debut directors, just the sort of shakiness that you would expect from someone who hasn't helmed a film before. On the plus side, the cinematography in this movie looks fantastic, aided by the fact they had a lot of international locations, and so the film often looks stunning as it does its travelogue, where Wilde is going from place to place to place. However, when it comes to the storytelling, it is a little bit uneven, especially in regards to pacing. I think this is to do with the film's editing, which I think is the thing that is most uneven about the movie, I would say. I think that certain elements of the movie and certain scenes don't carry on long enough as they really should do. Some scenes feel a little bit abrupt. I think that there is definitely some rough moments in this movie, especially with regards to audio editing. There is a lot of conspicuous ADR work in this movie. There was a couple of instances where lip movements weren't matching what people were saying at all, just a handful of moments. And yet, because the story is so well told in general, those really didn't affect things for me all that much. But I definitely get the sense that Everett was very much learning on the job. There is a little bit of inexperience that I think can be felt at certain points, but nevertheless, I think he's very much supported by a strong cast. Colin Firth has a fairly small role in this movie. They've been friends for many years, and they've appeared in quite a few films together, not just The Importance of Being Earnest, but also the St. Trinian's movies, and so on and so forth. And Firth plays a fairly small role here. He's mostly in the film's first act and also in the film's third act, and he's fairly good, but not especially remarkable. He's very much there to essentially be a big name guest star. I do think that Emily Watson makes a little bit more of an impression as Constance, which is again a fairly small part, and she doesn't have a lot of screen time with Everett because of the predicament that the characters find themselves in, and yet in spite of that, you still get a sense that she does love and care for Wilde to a certain extent, in spite of what has happened between them and the betrayal that she feels once Wilde pursues the relationship with Bosie. And they provide fine support in relatively small parts. Elsewhere in the movie, you've also got Tom Wilkinson, who turns up very, very late in the movie. He provides a welcome note of comedy to the film, and actually provides a further connection with the earlier Wilde biopic. He, of course, played Bosie's father in that movie. He was very much a villainous figure. Here, he's much lighter, and he's there to bless Wilde in the dying stages of his life, and it's a fairly amusing little cameo almost. And I do get the sense that, if nothing else, Everett really manages the tone quite well of this. There is a certain melodrama to the events of this movie that could have felt a little bit heavy, especially in the film's later stages where Wilde's health is declining quite precipitously, and yet at the same time there is this very strong sense of humour. There is this Wildean wit all the way through it, and is incorporated even to the very end of the movie, with not only Wilkinson's appearance, but also certain lines that Wilde says. There is an actual quote by Wilde that is incorporated in the movie where Wilde sees the wallpaper on the wall and says, "I'm in mortal combat with this wallpaper, Robbie. One of us has to go." And that line is very, very funny. And there's plenty of moments like that in this movie. And it very much is about handling what has happened with Wilde and how he manages to still treat it with fairly good humour. The Happy Prince is a really pleasant surprise for me, and I was won over by Everett's ambition. And although the two movies do share commonalities, in terms of execution, I think the two movies are very diametrically opposed. I think this is the far superior film, largely because it dispenses with biopic cliches by focusing on a very specific period of time in a person's life, and in doing so locate what is most intriguing and fascinating about them and why their story should be told on screen, rather than trying to encompass everything about a person's life. While this movie may not be entirely accessible to Wilde newcomers because of that, I do think it gets a far better sense of who Wilde was as a person. And that is also in part because of Everett's performance, which I think is definitely one of the best that he has ever given on screen, if not the very best performance that he has ever given. I think this is really, really solid work, and that Everett should be very proud of himself. I think that all of his hard work, all the years that he's spent trying to bring this to fruition, have really paid off. This is a really great film. Go seek it out. The Happy Prince is a passion project in the best possible way because Rupert Everett's devotion to the film is apparent at every moment, and it is clear why in his performance as Oscar Wilde, whom he inhabits brilliantly. While behind the camera, Everett is clearly not as confident. Despite lush cinematography from country to country, the film's editing is a little rough. His enthusiasm and conviction in the story that he's telling carries the audience through, and it is engrossing, especially Wilde's doomed romance with Bosie with a wonderfully cruel turn by Colin Morgan. Aided by fine support from Colin Firth and Emily Watson, this is a heartbreaking but surprisingly witty look, as one would expect, at the last years of Wilde as he descends into squalor and desperation, and Everett's effort does not go unrewarded. If you like this review, then you can write a poem over at my Patreon, where you can see my reviews early among other perks, but until next time, I'm Matthew Buck, fading out.